thetonarm.com.
It's Saturday, November 23rd, a day that has chosen us and we've chosen it to welcome everyone here and to thank everybody for coming and to join us to celebrate the release of a terrific new book about a person that many of us here admire, if not revere. And that book is Chapel Perilous, The Life and Thought Crimes of Robert Anton Wilson. And it's written by my friend and colleague and my guest today, Gabriel Kennedy. And there's so much to cover, and I want to make sure that we leave space for some audience discussion later on. So I think, like good chaos magicians, we should just get right the fuck to it and dispense with ceremony. So Gabriel, welcome and congratulations on the book.
Thank you so much, man. Great to be here, man.
Yeah, it's great to have you. So I also want to tell our audience to please feel free to hit up the chat. I'll do my best to keep an eye on it, and if people have questions or if they just want to talk to each other, that's all good. And without further ado, I think what I'd like to start is by asking you, what was your entry path to Bob? What was your first Bob, if you will?
First entry path to Bob. Man, you're bringing me back now. Yeah, I guess it was high school. the senior year of high school. It was in math class, and a fellow student who is now, a very good bizarro fiction writer, a writer in general, a man named Bradley Sands. We were classmates, and Brad would always come into class with all these books, these like huge books, like James Joyce, and a bunch of Robert Anton Wilson. And one day he came in with Luminatus trilogy, and I was intrigued by the cover of the book, and I asked him, let me take a look at that, and looked at the back, cover, and talked about the secret society called the Illuminati that run the world. And if you look at your dollar bill in a certain way or something, you could see all the symbols for it. So that was it. That was the first time I was ever introduced to like a notion of some sort of clandestine secret society that is able to pull all the strings and control everything in the world of a planet of, how many billion people. And yeah, I mean, and that was it. I mean, I read the first few pages, and I think because it was set up like a pulp detective novel, I think that really got me. And I was just totally intrigued by the story, and I read it that summer, my senior year of high school, and I was hooked. I was absolutely hooked. And I think what a lot of things stood out, but I'd gone to Catholic school my whole life at that point. I got kicked out of Catholic school in my senior year, and that's when I read Illuminatus trilogy. So it was a nice deconditioning period in some ways. And Bob's book played a big part in it because, that's when he talked about, the H.P. Lovecraft mythos and the old ones, and, Cthulhu and Yog-Sothoth. And that scared the living shit out of me, like a kid raised within like the kind of
Scares
Catholic
me now.
paradigm. Right. I was like, I was blown away by the fact that there could be like gods that are older than the God that exists and the God that I was told about. And that freaked me out because, when I thought about the far out things as a child, obviously it was always through the lens of a Catholic sort of paradigm and stuff, and so I couldn't even conceive of like multiple gods at that point. And that book just like opened so many doors, and like built a whole house, and then it opened all those doors, and it left enough clothes for me to want to keep wandering around that house, and figuring out what's all this about. And so that book really like inspired an intense kind of interest in like history. And I was about to go into college. So Illuminatus trilogy really became like this, like, and Robert Anton Wilson became this kind of motivating force just to kind of like do my own research while going to like college and stuff. So like it was awesome. Yeah, it was, what a great time to be introduced to his work, because Illuminatus trilogy, they did it, I think, on purpose like that. It's that pulp version, it appeals to teenagers especially, I think.
Yeah, it's really interesting that was your way in. I'm sure it's similar for a lot of people. My way in was Cosmic Trigger, which I think is probably second to the trilogy in terms of how people may have come into Bob. But I always tell people, like, especially that trilogy, it's the closest you can come to the feeling of psychedelics without actually putting anything in your body. Like his work is uniquely able to do something to give you ego death while you're reading, and certainly to get you to question all your realities. It's really incredible.
100%.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was able to do that, and I mean, so many people during the interviewing of this my book, spoke about that, like his magical use of language. He sort of did, while Robert Anton Wilson really did display or show, or implement hypnotizing techniques in his work.
Yeah. At what point did you have the audacity to think that it was time for a Bob biography and that you should be the one to do it?
Well, before Bob died, no,
You were carrying it for that long?
no, he well, basically, so Bob died in 2007, and I was a part of the Maybe Logic Academy crew. There was about maybe 20 of us, maybe 23 of us, that were like kind of hardcore members of the Maybe Logic Academy, which was a, you know, an online teaching, remote teaching academy that like Wilson, you know, started with his friend and collaborator Lance Bauscher. So like Bob started Maybe Logic in 2004, and for the last 3 years of his life, like, you know, me and a bunch of like Bob heads were like talking to him all the time, mostly through the website, through classes and stuff. And it was just like everything kind of coalesced. Like, this is my first book, and for a long time I held on to this notion that like a book about Bob was going to be my first book. So I've been working on this book for a number, like almost since he died, really. But in fits and starts. I wrote my way into the biography, if you will.
Mm.
I wanted to write books about Bob's philosophy. I wanted to write about, you know, Wilson's, you know, notions of scientific philosophy as compared to like modern day academics and stuff like that. And then I realized, like, I know this is going to be a lot of work. You know, like uh, yeah, but it was very fruitful. It was very, very good. Because what I was doing was just landing on, like I said, like this biography, because I wrote through all of Bob's ideas. Like I have tons of notebooks on it. I basically have like two other books, you know, two small books about Bob's ideas. Um, and then I just eventually got to the point where I knew I needed to ground all these ideas because Bob moved around so much and his ideas shifted a little bit through time. I wanted to contextualize his thought crimes, right? And really, ever since reading Cosmic Trigger, I was fascinated by how much this guy moved around during the 70s. It seemed like he was moving every other few pages. And I couldn't understand how a man who could produce like such an amazing work could be moving around so much and have a family of you know, a wife and 4 kids and a dog or two, and, you know, maybe a, you know, cat here and there. And also, he doesn't write about it. He had his dying mother live with him too, during the late 70s. And I don't know how Bob did all this stuff, you know. And so I was
Yeah.
completely fascinated by that. And I wanted to ground his ideas, like I said, and then I eventually landed on that, um, you know, in a villa in Portugal, a very glorious time. And I was like, this is it. This is what I'm going to do. And then I'm just going to write this. And at first it was like, I'm just going to write this biography, a biographical spine to then utilize for the book. And that just became obviously the book itself. Because it was just so like interesting, you know. And one question led to another, and then suddenly I was like Saul Goodman in Illuminatus, and I was looking for the Illuminati files, you know, the Illuminati memos of Bob's life, and I got led around the country and you know, into special collections libraries, you know, all over America, and then, you know, even into Ireland a little bit, and, you know, speaking to people, you know, deep into Europe, you know, all trying to find out about more about the man who wrote or co-wrote this amazing book and wrote so many other amazing books, you know. Yeah, so that's a roundabout answer.
Were there any troves in particular that you came across that were either like surprising finds or that were particularly fruitful? You know, because I would imagine when you learn that there are papers somewhere, you might not be entirely sure what to expect, or you might have some suspicion about what it holds. But were there places you went where you were like, oh, this is the goods?
Great question, man. You know, all of them in a way felt like that, right? Every new find was like another like gift, right? Another,
Yeah.
you know, holiday,
Hmm.
right? But the Discordian archives were awesome, right? And I got those from Adam Gorightly, who, you know, fellow writer, spent a lot of time writing about Discordianism, and he inherited the Discordian archives, excuse me, which he was given them by yeah, through the Discordian Society, if you will. And at one time, Bob had held those archives because those are like Greg Hill's archives, and they've
Mhm.
accumulated over the years. So Adam, lent me a bunch of amazing stuff, letters from Bob to Greg Hill. Those were really, really, that was a treasure trove. Seeing, the exchange between the legendary, mysterious, mythical Greg Hill and Robert Anton Wilson. So much has been said and written about Kerry Thornley, but who is Greg Hill, right? Who is Gregory Hill? Malaclips the younger, um, and where's the Malaclips the elder?
Malaclips, did you get any further insight? Like, can you answer that question any better? Who was Greg Hill?
I think I could a little bit. Greg was had a huge heart. It seemed like he was a very, very good friend, a very loyal guy. For instance, when Bob was going through what he was going through with Kerry Thornley, I guess around 1975, Wilson writes that Kerry Thornley pretty much had like a schizophrenic breakdown and
Yeah.
was sending crazy letters to him and other people. And Robert Shea has a letter sort of addressing that as well to Greg Hill, like, hey, Kerry's a little much right now, like. And then Greg Hill, has a letter to Bob, which is like you could see that, like, wow, this is Hill's oldest friend, like Hill is there with Kerry when even Bob was like, hey, you're too much right now. Like imagine
Yeah.
Wilson being like that. And Greg Hill, writes a letter. I've read that letter from Greg Hill to Wilson sometime around 1975. Like, yeah, I'm with Kerry right now. He's going through a lot. This is very intense for him and whatnot. So um, Hill as well struggled with alcohol. So there was some really interesting letters um, between he and Wilson addressing pretty much when Bob was living near Hill in Northern California. Like they were living closer than they ever lived before for a number of months, but they hardly saw it. They didn't see each other at all. It was during a time when Hill had started sort of like a failed, kind of community. It wasn't really like a commune. They wanted to start like a whole Discordian community, him and a few other Discordians. But like by the time that Bob and his family showed up, Hill the community was falling apart, and Hill was like holed up in his room. His wife was leaving him or something. He was breaking up with his wife or something like that, and he was just in an alcoholic, just like downspin, contemplating suicide like every day. Like he has in a letter to Bob, like, and I would about him looking at like one of his knives and just ending it all and stuff like that. So Hill definitely went through it, right? He went through some heavy doldrums, if you will, right? um and then when he's sort of speaking Discordian philosophy or just that sort of thing, Eastern mysticism with Bob, that's when his wisdom shines. That's when you see Malaclips come out. um these are some things I didn't put in the book because it was sort of like a tangent, but
Yeah.
there's some couple letters between Hill and Robert Shea, sort of discussing Bob's new enthusiasm in the mid 70s for like life extension and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And they're both like, nah, not into it. Like, you're gone, man. And Greg sent Bob a letter, asked him in the letter, it was a long letter. It was a great discussion, but this was one little aspect of the letter. And he's like, Bob, like, do you really want to live forever, man? Like, seriously, you know? And so I thought that was really endearing, that here's we all Robert Anton Wilson's so great, but then here's just his buddy just almost
Speaking
putting him in
truth to him.
check.
Yeah.
Yeah. So he's a very endearing sort of character.
Yeah. This digression we're in around Greg Hill could be applied to several other people in the book and throughout Bob's life. And obviously, we don't have time to get into all of them, but it really hints into the fact that there's a whole world of literature waiting to be written about these countercultural figures and these outside the mainstream thinkers whose ideas really foreshadowed a lot of the sort of insanity that we live with now. They really saw it coming, or they really articulated how the possibility of ending up here could come into being. But one of the people that I'm most curious about, and I think it relates to what you said earlier about Bob's ability to do what he did, is Arlen, is his wife. And there's multiple topics that you treat very sensitively throughout the book, and maybe we can come back to some of them. But I'm really curious about Arlen because she seems like if she were not married to Bob and overshadowed by him, she'd be an incredible, and she was an incredible figure in her own right in terms of her intellectual pursuits and her interests and her ability to, you talk a lot about how she was often the one that made sure they had sort of a social community. She would host the salons and the dinner parties and maybe, you know, led a lot of like the moving of the family, not in the unrooted way that they often were, but made sure that they often went back to the family and that they often reconvened as a family when she and Bob would go off into the wilderness. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about Arlen and and her impact and her place in this story.
Yeah, thanks, Lawrence. Right, Arlen, Arlen Riley Wilson, the great Arlen Riley Wilson. We all heard about her so much in the writings of Bob, and maybe for the people that knew Bob and Arlen, they knew Arlen. Um, Everyone I spoke to about Arlen, they absolutely adored her. They loved Arlen, um, and nearly everyone could see that they were a partnership. They were a partner. They were partners. Excuse me, like a dyad. In the words of John C. Lilly. Um, I think that says a lot because who could anyone be without anyone? It's really hard to think or speak about that. I don't know what Arlen would be doing without Bob, just as I don't know what Bob would be doing without Arlen. And especially have to contextualize it for when they were around, because Arlen was a dynamic individual, highly intelligent. She was raised by she was raised in a wealthy family. So her mother was sort of like a social debutante in New York City. The art community, art world. Her mom was like an opera singer, and her children, her two daughters, Christina and Alex, both conveyed to me that Arlen's mother was an opera singer with the Met. So she was really tied in with the New York city art worlds, I guess dating to the 1940s and whatnot, even sooner before then. So Arlen grew up with very strong mother, it seemed like already. And her father was from Scotland, successful businessman, worked in the textile industry, and had a severe addiction to alcohol, and sadly, like, to abusing Arlen and her sister when they were kids. The story that I got was, like physical and like, mental torture, basically. When Arlen and her sister Janet were children, her father would like march up to their bedrooms in the middle of the night and demand that they march down to the kitchen, and he would stand them against the wall while holding like a sword, basically, and give them quote unquote etiquette lessons while he drank, right? So if they were tired and started to slouch, he would like, smack them on the head or part of their body with the flat end of a sword. So I think that'll leave an impression in any young child's mind. And so both her and both Bob and Arlen, they were they're important because of what they did with what they were given, right? And
Yeah.
that's why we're talking about them now, because we could still learn from how they lived, because they chose to live like anticipatorily, if you will. They were futuristic, right? Not in any far out sense, but in the sense that Arlen was a strong person as an individual, and she was not going to let things stop her, or societal niceties get in the way of what she shouldn't do. So for instance, she married, Bob was her third husband, right? People don't really know that, like she was briefly married when she was in her 20s to a man who I was told physically abused her, and she married him to get away from her father. Basically, her mother had already divorced her father, and her mother was living in New York City. And so Arlen, was basically had a dream of just going to New York City and pursuing a life as an artist, as a writer. Her sister became an actress who actually, starred in a Hollywood movie. She was also a stage actress, before she, I guess, had an early retirement. Her sister Janet, and married Hollywood. Uh, she had a series of marriages, and her sister ended up in Mexico. And so Arlen wasn't, rightfully satisfied with being put in a position within any relationship, I think, that like robbed her of her agency. And she really held on to that. As I said, she was like highly intelligent. Anyone that hung out with Bob and Arlen, like you were mentioning, like the salons and whatnot, that's where she that's where she shined. Say that 3 times fast. Arlen
Mhm.
shined at the salons. Yeah. So
Hmm.
she was extremely social, right? And I wonder, again, with both of them, like with all the means of like communication technology to get your ideas out there, like her and Bob at a salon would have been like an amazing podcast, I'm sure,
Yeah.
because she was very extemporaneous. But she had, I was also told, like by Christina, like a severe case of ADHD, which played a part in the constant moving. Actually, she had this intense case of restlessness, and Arlen, would start these projects, these amazingly awesome sounding projects, but then after a number of weeks or months, it would just kind of filter out, and something
Uh,
else would kind of filter in. And I think that's one thing that she really loved and admired about Bob, was his consistency. This is my own intuitive take on it. Like, here was a man that like was so fucking disciplined. Like, they moved so much, and this guy would be able to craft a little corner somewhere and just write for hours. I mean, because he's a professional writer. We take that for granted, right? But that is not an easy task, especially on your body. The great Eric Bogosian, the playwright and writer, has commented about how writing a fucking book is like really hard on your body, point
yeah.
blank. And Bob, with his polio leg cramps, would just fucking smoke weed and write for hours.
And you
And
look at his bibliography, I mean, it's like, did he ever do anything else? And we know now he did. He lectured, he traveled, he schemed all kinds of schemes. And like that output, if you had said to me during the book, if I was reading the book and it said, Bob was an extreme meth head or a speed freak, I would have believed it, because I don't know how, how else he could have accomplished what he did. It's incredible.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, I stayed away from psychoanalyzing anyone, or Bob,
Yeah.
especially in the book. But I do that all the time. Like, I read things, psychoanalyze myself. I think that's just the culture we're in, right? Everything is psychoanalyzable. Um, and I was also, told, when Christina and Alex, when you seek to make sense of your parents, and you basically think, what the fuck was wrong with them? And like, and I love them. What did I learn from them? As the great DMX said, my mother, my father, I love them, I hate them. Uh, Sometimes I can't stand them, but I'm glad that God made them, you know. And I think that's what the children of Bob and Arlen Wilson might feel a little bit as well, um, which is so amazing to think about. And that grounds Bob and Arlen a lot more, that they were great people, great intellectuals, and tried real hard, but there's just so much energy you have. And raising children when you're bohemian artists and traveling, between countries in the 60s and 70s leaves a toll,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
and yeah, man. So
Before we
yeah,
move on from Arlen, I want to ask in your research and in the materials you looked at, is there anything that could be even loosely called an Arlen archive? Was she a correspondent? Did she leave letters? Like, is there room for a look at her at some point, or is there not enough source material?
I think there's room. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Um, I accessed some letters between Arlen and a friend of hers from Chicago, a fellow anarchist feminist, woman named Arlene Myers. She was sort of a kind of early member, founding member of really interesting newsletter journal called Siren,
Hmm.
which was they call it like anarcha feminism, so it's just as it sounds, feminism and anarchism, right? And and that's an interesting area of feminism because that branch of feminism, emphasizes the individual, over the gender role. However, the gender role is extremely important, especially, understanding the history. It doesn't, anarcho-feminism, from my understanding, you know, doesn't, soften the criticism of dudes messing up stuff for thousands of years, but it also takes into consideration we're individuals, though, which is a really interesting conversation within feminism. And that was a fun sort of rabbit hole I fell down, thinking about the different brand types of feminism and what Arlen was into. And that's represented in those letters with her and Arlene Myers for the most part. Um, there are articles that Arlen wrote that I accessed um, from the 60s, which are extremely informative. During that time, she had a really cool, she seemed to have been writing a book about basically women's history,
Hmm.
uh, and sort of like a feminist anthropology, right? Like paleoanthropology, like going way back, thousands of years, which I suspect some of that material made it into Bob's book, Ishtar Rising,
Yeah.
and the earlier incarnation, Playboy's Book of the Breast. Um, I put that in the book, I think, right? Like that Arlen sort of inspired that in a way, and Bob, that conversation. I'd say she definitely, her and her friends and like social groupings. I believe that Bob had a like an impasse, if you will, with Arlene Myers um, around like letters that were sent that were kind of like so I'll briefly get into it. I'll tell you that in the mid 70s, like Bob was contributing to like an anarchist newsletter, SRAF newsletter, or something like that, and so were some of his friends. And Arlene Myers contributed, and she called Bob and another writer named Jeffrey Stewart misogynists, male chauvinist pigs. And Bob responded with his take. And the debate that they basically had was, Bob basically landed on the side like, look, we're individuals first. Um, so I don't accept your take of calling me a male chauvinist pig, because it was based on a sort of screed on free love, right? Um, and so that sort of led to, I don't know, a little something between them. And then Bob received a letter that was signed by the Siren, staff, and it was like a kind of like a demeaning sort of letter, and he just assumed that Arlene Myers wrote it. Um, but it was signed the Siren Staff, and it was only Arlene and someone else who could have wrote it, right? And so then Arlen has a bit of a couple an exchange, a friendly exchange with Arlene, and Arlene denies writing the letter, right? Which was like kind of interesting because one could be, and I don't know where Bob landed on it, but one could be like, why is she lying? Why is she lying that she wrote the letter? However, through the lens of history, you know, realizing that this letter was written during a time when the FBI was writing fake letters and sending them to different organizations
To
to
create dissent.
drive people to start, yeah, to create dissent. You know, a little fun thing they had going called COINTELPRO, right? and and that was they were that Chicago scene, that activist scene that Bob and Arlen were involved in, were surveilled. They were all surveilled by the Chicago Red Squad. I accessed those files on Bob and Arlen during the research of this book,
Yeah, it's
which was
incredible
pretty
how many of
awesome.
those files were destroyed and you were still able to get the ones on Bob. Like it's such a stroke of luck, I suppose, or synchronicity that of all the things that the police destroyed, a lot of the material on Bob and Arlen was still survived.
Yes, and I mean, I wonder. I mean, if there are some things about Bob and Arlen there that did get destroyed, right? Because you don't, there's no record of like the things they destroyed.
They didn't keep a list of what they there's no bibliography of what they
Sadly,
but
there's no Chief Wimby there with a
yeah.
safe full of the names that they destroyed.
We have just to change topics for a second. We have a question that somebody typed. Uh, Nicholas wants to know, how did Bob come across chanting the Lotus Sutra, and did he continue to practice chanting for the rest of his life? What insight, if any, do you have on that? Because you talk a lot about the various practices he sort of experimented with and or embraced throughout his life.
Yeah, that was fascinating. Bob really, I mean, this is one of the things that later on he gets a lot of admiration for, I guess, especially within the chaos magic scene, is that he was so, exploratory in his like spiritual searchings and whatnot, but I mean, it's the zeitgeist of the time, though, right? There was such a surge in awareness of Buddhism and yoga and theosophy and other sort of magic, of course, uh, at that era, during the era
Mm.
of American history, right? And Bob was just a receiver. He was there. That's why he's, especially him during the 70s, he's such a classic sort of personality, because he was an open line, man. He was an open channel. He was just like, like as Pete Carroll, one of the co-founders of Chaos Magic, said about Bob's brain, it was like a jet engine. He was just sucking in all this fucking awesome information and making sense of it, processing it. His
Yeah.
his processing speed was so fast. He was like functioning on quantum computer like levels, during an era of like first generation PCs or whatever. Um, but uh, when it comes to Nicholas's question, uh, the Lotus Sutra, I think he might be speaking about when Bob was chanting. I want to find the exact chant, but it was basically related to this branch of Buddhism called Nichiren Buddhism, right? And Nichiren Buddhism, quickly from my understanding, was born out of a monk who went up to a mountain and chanted this beautiful chant, and of course it means something deep and amazing and beautiful, and that sort of became the tradition within that branch, that if you chant this phrase with a full heart, um, you'll be best blessed by Buddha, if you will, right? Um, and of course, the Lotus Sutra, which is like one of the most important sort of sutras in that like belief system is a part of that. So Bob started doing that like in the 60s, in the late 60s when he was in Chicago. I don't know how he found the church to come across the Nichiren Buddhism, right? But it was pretty cool. And so Christina, would speak about memories of just seeing Bob on their, leather couch, their L-shaped leather couch, just taking a break from writing and chanting and whatnot. And I mean, again, Bob was an early adapter to Buddhism within the American counterculture and then within American culture. In the early 1960s, this monk, sort of famous now, maybe infamous monk, Yasutani Roshi, who was from Japanese monk, came over and gave one of the first sort of Dharma lectures in America in Yellow Springs, Ohio, and Bob and his family were there, right? So Bob was like he was at one of the first, maybe meditation retreats in America, right? Buddhist meditation retreats in America. And, of course, Buddhism was in America before 1962, but this was like the first like major wave of that introduction. And Bob loved eclecticism, though. That's found within his early life, like in high school, him discovering Ezra Pound and also James Frazier, Frazier, who wrote The Golden Bow, and basically, I mean, some would say, created the field of comparative religious studies. So there it is again, and Ezra Pound, who, was so obsessed, fascinated with like putting together his own sort of curriculum and full of eclectic sources. I think Pound is a big influence intellectually on Bob's love of eclecticism. But then again, too, like Bob just had that personality, right? I think he shared that personality with Ezra Pound, not the fascism stuff so much, or the love of Mussolini. He wasn't into
Everybody
that.
has their limits.
Yeah. Once Pound was doing that fascist salute, I don't think Bob was really rocking with him. But Pound's discussion of economics and all that stuff, So yeah, long answer. That extended into Bob's exploration of spiritual systems.
Well, I think that something you're saying here dovetails into another question we have in the Q&A, which is from Neil. Um, and Neil's asking about how advanced Bob got and was with Crowley work. And I think, you do talk about that a fair bit in the book, so let's allude to some of it here. But I think what was coming up for me as you were speaking was Bob was less like a dilettante and a dabbler, and he was more of an experimenter. So he would try these systems and try to approach them like Crowley with something of a scientific bent, um, documenting his experiments, his trip journals, um, and really trying to understand or take away from each system what worked, what conditions made something happen or not happen. And so to accumulate the wisdom as opposed to somebody who was just a dabbler. I wonder, one, does that resonate with you at all? And two, could you talk a bit about Bob's immersion in Crowley's work and where in Bob's work his intimacy with Crowley is best illustrated? So maybe people here might be able to do some research for themselves.
For sure, man. Well, Bob was introduced to Aleister Crowley in his, famous telling of the tale in Cosmic Trigger through Alan Watts, who was like an amazing like mentor to Bob early in his career. It's Watts who turned Bob onto Crowley. Israel Regardie, who wrote the book on Crowley that Bob read, called The Eye in the Triangle. But Alan Watts also introduced Bob to the work of Tim Leary, which is pretty great. And I'd say, yeah, Bob is a great experimenter of a scientific bent. He went to Brooklyn Tech, right, as a teenager. He, had a strong analytic mind. That's what makes him so great. Is he's so literate. He's so ensconced, if you will, so in the tradition of classic literature. He's so well trained in the craft of writing, but he's also has a great analytical and scientific mind, theoretical scientific mind, much like Colin Wilson, which makes those two guys like a great combination. The Wilson boys. But so Bob already is bringing this to the table. He studied science, as Crowley recommends in his system. Yeah, Bob was like the aspirant, the student that Crowley wanted. Like
Yeah.
Crowley wanted people who were trained in at least one science. Crowley himself was trained in chemistry. That's one of the things that Bob absolutely loved about Crowley's work was, uh, you know, the the British men's adherence to the scientific method and the adherence to having a magic journal and a dream journal when you're deep in the work, right? And studying all surrounding conditions to your magical experiments, because they're all variables, in the laboratory that is your body mind, right? And so when Bob first got into Crowley in the early 1970s, he dove all in, as he does. He went all in. He took the oath of the abyss. This is a major part of Cosmic Trigger, right? Like this notion of uh, blurring the line between his imagination and reality. Where is the holy guardian angel? Where does it reside? Does it reside in objective reality? Does it reside in your imagination? Does it manifest when your imagination meets reality? And he was properly trained himself he read the books, if you will, that the probationer or the early grades are supposed to read. He read those books. He was fortunate that because he became friends with Grady McMurtry and his wife Phyllis McMurtry Sackler. And of course, Grady is legendary within the Thelemic lore because he's the guy that, like, just like Lord of the Rings, like he united the people, because in the late 60s, like the OTO was like a mess in California. And there were, in LA especially, there was this wild bunch of crazy kooks who were living in the desert calling themselves the OTO, and they were doing all types of messed up weird shit, all the weirdo shit that you hear about. And then Grady McMurtry was like, what is this? And he came in and he brought the law down, and he let everyone know that he had the mandate from Crowley to do this, et cetera, et cetera. So Bob became friends with Crowley, and not, excuse me, became friends with McMurtry, and McMurtry opened his library for Bob. So Bob just, with that jet engine mind, just read through all this stuff, processed all this information, and he took the trip. He bought the ticket. He took the trip. He committed himself to a self-initiation, took it very seriously. Excuse me. And he did all this, his most intense work with with Thelema, during a time of like, such movement, insane movement. He was moving every 6 months with his family, from Mexico to all over America, from Mexico to Chicago, back to Mexico, to Ohio, then to California, Northern California, different areas in Northern California, et cetera, et cetera. And not only was he maintaining sticking to Crowley's curriculum, which requires a whole bunch of interior work. You have to close the door and meditate and do all this sort of stuff. He was also writing, and then also figuring out how to get money to keep clothes on his kids' back,
Yeah.
and so, but I think all that played a part in him being able to sort of, get the message quicker. Like Bob, he was able to utilize risk in his life to, like, great results. He once wrote in a letter to Greg Hill that he thought he was happy despite taking all the risks that he had taken in his life, until he realized that he was happy because he was taking these risks.
Yeah.
Meaning he was embodying and living the edict from Joseph Campbell, like to literally follow your bliss, no matter where it leads, so long as it leads you closer to yourself, you know. And his perspective was on point when it came to the magic stuff. He used it for healing, you know, and self-empowerment, and not any sort of like weird, you
Nefarious
know,
thing. Yeah.
yeah, like
Yeah.
brainwashing or whatever. Like, and so um a great resource that really reflects all this work has been put out by Hilaritas Press, a book called Lion of Light. That was, I've written about this in my book, Chapel Perilous, The Life and Thought Crimes of Robert Anton Wilson.
There you go.
The it's basically Bob breaking down all the early work that one is supposed to do, you know, get tarot cards and you know, do readings and basically get in touch with your intuition. But as far as journals, like his magical diaries and his dream journals, which he does write about that he kept, right, those are gone, or I should say those have not been unearthed yet. Who knows what happened to those journals? However, it's my, you know, based on information and belief, that Bob put a lot of that stuff in his book, The Masks of the Illuminati, right? Which is a, you know, fictionalized story of an initiation within, you know, a student or adherent within the AA, you know, Crawley and Cecil Jones's magical order, right? So long
Let me
answer to your
interrupt.
question is
Do you
Bob got
think
into
he
it.
destroyed the journals and diaries?
I don't know. I don't know.
Like, where would they have gone?
Um, yeah, that's a very good question.
We just don't know.
Yeah, you know, again, because Bob moved around so much. You know, when I met Bob in 2003. I interviewed him July 24th, 2003, the day after the Maybe Logic premiere in Santa Cruz, California. Through the great help of David J. Brown, I was able to, you know, land an interview with Bob, and at his apartment. And I was shocked by how little books Bob had in his apartment. He barely even had his own books, you know? And I was like, what the fuck? Um, but now I totally get it.
Traveled
Like,
light.
he traveled light, and he really did practice like Buddhist non-attachment in a real beautiful way, like
Yeah.
non-attachment to certain physical things that, and I'm sure there were books that he loved. We all have books. I mean, that book I absolutely love. You know, Everything is Under Control. I've had that book since, I don't know, a long time. I can't imagine letting go of that book. But so yeah,
There's a
Bob traveled light.
there's a conversation going on in the chat about Rudolf Steiner, and the original question was, um, well, let me go back and read it more verbatim so that I don't screw up Daniel's question. Is there any correlation between Bob and Rudolf Steiner or the anthrop uh, Anthropophysical Society? I feel like in Cosmic Trigger, Bob talks about Steiner, but I don't remember. And maybe while you're talking about what you know, I'll check the index in your book and see if Steiner's in there.
I can tell you right now, he's not.
He's not.
Yeah, no. Um,
What do we know
I
there?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think, oh, maybe only in passing Bob might have ever mentioned Rudolf Steiner's name. I'm sure he's probably read some of his stuff. Yeah, I mean, I've never really encountered
Hmm.
Steiner through Bob.
Okay.
Um,
Okay.
Steiner, just from what I know, right? Like, and it's very little, honestly, but you know, he was linked in with Theosophy, right? The Theosophists, and then he sort of started his own system. Um, yeah, yeah. Bob doesn't get too deep in the Theosophy. really. Doesn't talk much about Madame Blavatsky. I mean, he does a little bit, but it's more, he mentions how important they were, right? In Cosmic Trigger, uh, Crawley, Gurdjieff, and the Theosophists are like the three strains of this what, Western esoteric tradition or something, right?
Yeah. There's some further discussion about Steiner's involvement with OTO. But to pivot away from that for a moment, one of the things that I realized coming into the conversation, and that's becoming more apparent the more time that passes, is just how much we won't get to. Um, and thank you, Daniel, actually, for that comment, because now I feel less stupid for being tongue-tied. Um, some of the things I want to make sure we get to, though, that would feel like crimes of omission. Um, could you talk about Leary? I mean, we have to talk about Leary. And there's a few figures whose names I'll say that I think we have to talk about. We have to talk about Leary. I think it would be nice to talk about George Carlin, even for a moment. Um, I'd also like to talk a little bit about Bob's influence and interaction with the cyberpunk movement. Like those are three things I want to talk about, mainly because um, the revere that people like Leary and Carlin held him in, it and and you give the anecdote in the book about George Carlin's daughter found a half tongue-in-cheek list of people that Carlin listed as his heroes after he passed, that she found after he passed. And Wilson's name was at the top of the list. And so I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about um, his relationship with Leary in so much as it can be encapsulated. Um, and then we can move on from there to some of the other figures.
Yeah. I mean, well, Bob and Leary, man, they were like a two-man team there for a while. When I encountered Bob, the work of Timothy Leary was like was not far behind. One time when Tower Records existed, uh, there was the back area of Tower Records that had all the books that Borders or Barnes and Nobles did not have, and that's where you could find like Crawley books and Leary books and Wilson books, and so those three kind of came as a package. But Bob met Leary in the early 1960s after being introduced to his work through, as I said before, Alan Watts. There was an essay that Bob had read of Leary's, I think it was around 1963. And he learned about Leary's work with psychedelics, psilocybin mushrooms. And he convinced, it didn't take much convincing, Paul Krasner to, flip the bill for him and Arlen to go visit Tim at the Millbrook Mansion in upstate New York. And at the time, Bob and Arlen were living in northern New Jersey. So it was a pretty easy trip. They drove there. There's a great article about it in The Realist. Leary's Psychological H-Bomb, the article is called. And Bob just he was such a nice writer, great writer sometimes, man. Like, so just him describing the scene of him and Arlen rolling up on the mansion and seeing Charles Mingus playing the fucking, I guess he played the saxophone, like he was just hanging out on top of a roof. Like, I read that description somewhere. I think it's in that article, but just the thought of that, like some great jazz musician, just you rolling up to the house and just some jazz musicians playing on the roof, right? And so they immediately hit it off during that interview session, which was around 1964. Bob not only was interested in Leary's using psychedelics, which Bob already had experience with. He had taken a bunch of mescaline a couple years earlier and had his own trip reports. But Leary was also utilizing game theory to contextualize and make sense of these far out experiences. And he and Richard Alpert and Richard Metzger were also using the Tibetan Book of the Dead to come up with new metaphors, obviously, to describe these experiences. These are things that we take for granted now, but during that time, people in the early 60s, like people were doing these like psychedelics and their minds were being absolutely blown and they had no idea how to contextualize this stuff, So Bob and Arlen left that day convinced that Leary was a person to watch, and he wasn't the only one who thought that. Leary was watched by like maybe He
Hmm.
was, even Richard Nixon was watching Leary, and so um, they just became, friends over the years, but they seemed to get much tighter when Leary was rearrested. So, briefly, Tim Leary was arrested in 1969. I think it was like in Orange County for possession of marijuana. And the story goes that it was like one joint. I'm not totally clear on that. Uh, there might be a couple other renditions of the story. Long story short, though, Leary was sentenced to 37 years in prison for a small amount of marijuana. And so that's why he was sent to jail, and wasn't for whatever. They had nothing on him, I guess, right? But the judge called him, before he put him away, the most dangerous man in America, right? There were serial killers going on, like roving in America. There were psychopathic war generals, like Lieutenant Calley just, did the My Lai massacre, right? But Tim Leary was the most dangerous man in America. Okay. So he was
Yeah.
put in jail. And then this dude, 50 years old, acting as a true Irish rebel, broke out of prison, right? And he figured out how to, because when Leary was put in holding or intake, they gave him a psychological exam, and the exam was the exam that he invented. It was based on the Leary circumplex, which was a personality exam, and he knew exactly what answers to give to get him put in the most minimum security prison as possible. And he did that, and then him and his brave wife at the time, Rosemary, I think it was Rosemary Leary, she was tied in with the SDS, and the Weather Underground. The Weather Underground were born out of the SDS, and she basically organized the prison heist for Leary from when he got out. She had people drive up to the prison the night that Leary escaped, and they were members of SDS, I think, and they drove off, and they skirted Leary out of the country to Algeria under an assumed name and fake passport, of where they then stayed with Eldridge Cleaver and his crew of Black Panthers, in Africa, for a
Fucking
brief
crazy.
period of time. Yeah, he lived a crazy life. And so when he, I believe Bob believed so, and also the current argument is that the CIA arrested Leary when he was changing flights in Afghanistan, and according to the argument of this book, The Most Dangerous Man in America, that came out a few years ago, like Richard Nixon zeroed in on Leary. He was the Julian Assange of the day. He was the top of Nixon's long fucking shit list. Excuse me. Oh, sorry. Do these things
Oh,
get
what?
okay, cool. Yeah. Everyone's
Yeah.
they're editing themselves on YouTube now. But yeah, so he was put in jail, he was processed, and then that's when Bob really came to Leary's, I guess, side, right? And he and Leary's archivist Michael Horowitz put together basically like the Leary kind of publicity defense group, if you will, and there's a couple different names for it. Offhand, I have it in my book. I don't remember the name of the organization that they formed at the time, but it was basically to promulgate Leary's new sort of like metaphor or idea: space migration, intelligence increase, and life extension. So they were Bob essentially, and that crew of people, but Bob specifically was constantly speaking about, like, Leary's scientific contributions, and why is this scientist in jail? Why are they subjecting this guy to psychological torture in jail? And they were psychologically torturing Leary in jail. They didn't drive him crazy, right? Leary was an extremely resilient personality. This is definitely not in the book. I did a major rabbit hole on Leary, like tons of research. But at one time, there was I forget, whatever the rumor that got circulated that LSD caused chromosome damage, right? I don't know if you might have heard that ever. But when they did a test on Leary's chromosomes or DNA, I don't know how you could do that. They found that they were like even healthier than like normal, right? So mixing that theory. So Leary was a major scapegoat in the mainstream media's eye, and from then on, he had a target on his back. He was, he was character assassinated pretty much. Like
Yeah.
when he was rearrested, uh, in Afghanistan, and they brought Leary back. What was going on was the feds were seeking to use him to take down this drug dealing ring called the Brotherhood of Eternal Love, and they also wanted to take down members of the Weather Underground. So their specific line of questioning to Leary when he was rearrested was basically, give us the names, give us some names, give us names of Weather Underground people, give us names of Brotherhood of Eternal Love people, because you're like the godfather of the Brotherhood of Eternal Love. And what was going on with that was these were a bunch of surfer LSD, kind of like characters out of Point Break, if you remember that movie.
But
Uh,
they ran the distribution, right? Really?
oh yeah, I mean they were serious, man. They
Yeah.
were they were
Heavy
legit.
cats.
I mean it was acid, like, but hey, they were doing it. And they, I guess, they sort of they gave Leary money or whatever here and there. They let him fucking stay at whatever place. So when Leary was arrested, that's what they were aiming for, to build this case really against these guys. But what's interesting is how the idea of media propaganda may or may not work. This could have just been me, or this is what I objectively read. Accessing, and one can do this, access the old New York Times articles about Tim Leary when he was rearrested and leading up to that trial. I mean, it's like straight, they're already calling him a snitch. Talk about trial by, in the public eye. Like the New York Times was doing this to Leary. Like, why was the New York Times completely framing Leary like a madman, a snitch, when he was not even, on trial for that? And when it came down to it, he never, snitched on, any member of the Weather Underground or the Brotherhood of Eternal Love. He did, like, two lawyers. Well, his lawyer, Michael Kennedy, I guess he said some things about, which is interesting. That's another tangent. Michael Kennedy was an activist lawyer, a very kick-ass lawyer, really. And he represented some like hardcore activists in his time. But he was the go-between, right, between the law and the Weather Underground. And Leary, I don't know, he had a grudge against Kennedy because he believed that Kennedy and his crew kind of took the house out from under him, Leary's house from him when he was in jail, took it as
Mm.
collateral, I think, for payment. And Leary wanted that house for his kids. So he was pissed, So Leary's like, you want to play games? Like,
Mm.
and
Yeah.
and the one person, but nothing happened to Michael Kennedy, didn't go to jail, nothing, right? Something happened. George Chulo, I think was his name, and I forget what role he played in the Leary saga there, but he like was a name that he floated, right? So there's a little bit of excuse me, this became like a big point of contention. Did Leary snitch when on the counterculture, when he was released from prison in 1976? And there were a lot of people who in the counterculture who didn't trust Leary anymore. So then when Bob was there from the jump, right? Leary was in the Pecos National Wilderness Forest in New Mexico, like right after he was released, and he was on the phone all the time with Bob, and Bob was there, like, working to help him reinvigorate his career. And Bob was really essential, really helped Leary out at that point in time, continued to help Leary out. Even when Leary was in jail, Bob helped edit big time. I think he really should be labeled the co-author of Game of Life, honestly, like, because that's a Leary book that came out during the late 70s. That was based off of a book that Leary and Bob wrote called The Periodic Table of Energy, which Leary wrote the most of the book, but I saw the drafts at the New York Public Library, And the margins are full of amazing editing details. Yeah, George Chulo. Yeah. Bob was, I don't know, Bob was just a loyal friend to Leary. He completely believed in Leary's like message, man. It's pretty amazing. And I mean, Leary was also an extremely charismatic individual. I never met him. I wish I did. Although, he was quick, and he seemed like he could be quick to show you love and also quick to admonish you for a quick second if he was a bit cranky. But hey,
He was Irish.
he was Irish.
All
You know what I mean?
right, let's
Uh,
talk about another Irishman. Talk to me about Carlin, and we don't have to stay there too long. But what's intriguing to me is, a lot of these characters, as a much younger person, they influenced my early life and different paths I went down. And it wasn't until later in life that I knew of the connections between Carlin and Wilson. And of course, in retrospect, they all make complete sense. But what do we know about the depth of their relationship? Was it a casual correspondence, or at some point in your book, Wilson mentions like that it sounds like they maintained a pretty, if it wasn't intimate in terms of space and the ability to hang, it was definitely over distance that they corresponded and traded information. And just curious about what you learned or what insights you might have into their relationship.
yeah, man, Bob and George. That's not a relationship that many people would even be aware of, I think, um, especially casual readers of Robert Anton Wilson. Though he wrote a lot about Carlin, especially in quantum psychology. I think that's where he goes into Carlin's Seven Dirty Words sketch, which is great because
Yeah.
he's talking about the neurosemantic relationships between the words we use and the way we see our perception of the world. Um, but Bob was like, when he was protective of, I think, his more famous friends, right? So meaning he was not someone who was always dropping names. So I saw Bob speak December 4th, 2001 at the Renaissance Hotel in San Francisco, California, just south of Market Street. And it was during the question and answer period. I just gotten aware that, like, whoa, is Bob friends with George Carlin? Like, I knew of Carlin's stuff before I knew Bob's stuff.
Yeah,
I
me
grew
too.
up, privileged enough to have home box office, HBO, when I was a kid. And those Carlin specials were like
Might
fucking
have been the start of it
amazing.
all. Might have been the start of all this.
Yeah, right. Yeah, man. I don't know what it was. I was like a child. Like what this guy was saying was making me laugh. And then Carlin is just like Bob because he'll meet you on the scatological humor. He'll meet you at the 2-year-old level and he'll just, guide you to adulthood,
Yeah.
um, intellectually. So, but, um, in the question and answer period of that lecture, I asked Bob just straight out. I was like, "Are you friends with George Carlin?" And very, very brusquely, he just said, "Yeah." That was it, man. And like I was like, "Okay," because Carlin was still alive.
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
impressive.
and but the story goes that Carlin was one of Bob's earliest fans. Him and Tom Robbins discovered the work of Robert Anton Wilson and Paul Krasner's The Realist magazine in 1959, like at the very start of Bob's career. You know, they could have discovered 1959, 1960, etc. But that's where Bob started his career. With a great column called Negative Thinking. And, the things that Bob was saying. I mean, it was his first article, The Semantics of God, where he was questioning whether or not God had a penis, because like, how do we think, why do we conceive of, a gender for God? Like, which today, I mean, our culture has processed this and digested this so many times and has really come around to what Bob was saying, which is like a Tao, God is sort of like this Taoist right? It's a process and interacting processes. Bob is basically a process philosopher. And where we're at today is that's where even priests will talk about God like that today, but not in 1959.
Yeah.
Like he was like a bad Catholic, for saying that. And Carlin and Tom Robbins read this sort of material. Paul Krasner read that article. It was like, dude, you got a job. Like, here you go. Thank you. Because that's what Bob brought to that underground journalist scene, like this insane disciplined madness, right? When you could read some of those articles, there are some great articles, especially in the realist, but some articles in the underground scene were just like, where's your brain is fried on acid, bro. Your brain is the two eggs on the frying pan and the yolk
Mm-hmm.
is not runny.
Yeah.
But Bob was, he really brought this like discipline to all that. And so Carlin picked up on that early, was inspired by Bob's sort of linguistic philosophy. Carlin himself was fascinated with words. His father had written by hand, like, all the works of Shakespeare. I think that was George Carlin's father. His father was a public speaker. The gift of gab was in him. Carlin was from friggin' near Harlem. You know what I mean? Carlin knew how to talk, and he understood Bob's. He picked up what Bob was putting down. Like Bob was from the mean streets of South Brooklyn. Like that was another kindred spirit. Like Bob was kindred spirits with Leary. They bonded over things beyond intellect. They both, and same with Carlin. They just understood each other, I think. And fast forward to many years later, I put it in the book of a time when Joseph Metheny, a great writer in his own right, the creator of the Ong's Hat conspiracy theory, before he created this great conspiracy theory, he was a driver of Robert Anton Wilson. Kind of like how all the crime bosses, they give their best knowledge to their drivers. You know what I mean? And uh, one night, Bob surprised Metheny. Metheny was thinking he was taking Bob to another lecture. I put this in the book,
Yeah.
but really they drive to a show, a performance of George Carlin. Not only do they get to see this performance of George Carlin, but they're hanging out with George Carlin after the show. Not only are they hanging out with George Carlin in the green room after the show, but they're like going to get donuts and coffee like at 3 a.m, still hanging out with Carlin. That's how much George loved Bob. You know what I mean? Like he just performed an hour. You're tired even after 20 minutes, after a 5 minute set in front of those lights, you're drained. Carlin, did an hour and he had this much time for Bob. So that says something about the
Yeah.
respect and admiration he had for him.
Yeah. So we're getting really good questions in the Q&A, so I kind of feel better about letting the audience drive some of the rest of our time together. One of the questions we have is about dreams and Bob's insight, I'm sorry, thoughts and insights you might have on Bob's thoughts and relationship and thinking around dreams.
Um, what I came across in the text in his writing, I'm sure he's thought about, maybe written a little bit about Jungian interpretations of dreams, and of course Freudian interpretations of dreams. But Bob's work is a study of looking at his dreams, perhaps in a magical way, in a thelemic way, because as we said before, he was encouraged through thelema to keep a dream journal, right, during all his magical workings. And excuse me. And but even before the magic stuff, he was he did keep dream journals, because he has, I think it's in Ishtar Rising, he writes about, I think it was a dream he had in like April 1968. Don't peg me on that there. I believe that's the name, that's the time, 1968, April 1968, of where he is in like he gets taken to the Playboy Club or something. And he just encounters like all the Chicago underworld figures. And then he keeps going further underground until he realizes that he could, right. And he
Hmm.
flies away. I could check it right now, the exact nature of that story. But the point being, Bob is already writing down his dreams in the 60s.
Yeah.
So, uh, in high school, he came across the book, a book written that was the name of the book escapes me right now, but it's a book that talks about like developing or the Jung's aspects, Jung's description of personality, excuse me. So the four types of personality, and Bob determined he was like, highly rational and he wants to develop his intuition. So sure, he became more and more aware of his dreams, and keeping track of them as time went on. But in the 70s, he kept, it seems like a disciplined practice of keeping a dream journal as it related to magic. And that dream journal again is nowhere to be found at this time. However, it seems as if he put a lot of this material perhaps in Masks of the Illuminati, his fiction work, which is all about a self-initiation or an initiatory process into the Western esoteric tradition.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, he mined his journals for so much of the fiction and nonfiction. Um, One of the other questions we have around, I'm so glad this came up because it was something I wanted to get to, was Bob's work on behalf of and his interactions with the characters at the fundamental physics group. You spend a little bit of time in the book talking about Bell's theorem and its impact on Bob, and I wonder if you could talk about his relationship there with those characters.
Sure, yeah. Excuse me. The So the fundamental physics group, it's a great book about them called How the Hippies Saved Physics by MIT professor David Kaiser. That was a very good resource during my research. The fundamental physics group grew out of all these particle physicists in Berkeley in the late 60s, early 1970s. Bob, and then there were all these little sort of, splinter groups or side groups. So Bob got down with the Physics Research Consciousness group, which were a couple of the members from the fundamental physics group, and then maybe some people who are not involved in that. So in the Physics Consciousness Research group, that consisted of Saul Paul Sarag, Jack Sarfati, and God, his first name escapes me, but Wolf. Maybe someone in the comments will remember. He's also a prolific writer. He's written a lot about shamanism and quantum physics. Fred Allen Wolf. And then also, so these are like the three core guys in the Physics Consciousness Research Group. And then, Bob was also friends with Nick Herbert, who I think he was in the fundamental physics group, but he was not in the Physics Consciousness Research Group. He made it a point to tell me that, I think. And if I'm wrong, Nick, please let me know. And Bob linked up with them through Timothy Leary, actually. Leary was in prison and he was contacted to, I think he was editing a awesome short-lived sort of special edition newsletter called Spit in the Ocean. I think that was what it was called. And Ken Kesey was involved in it. And Leary was the editor of this one particular issue. And he, of course, wanted to talk about physics. And he had gotten in touch with, I think, Jack Sarfati and then Saul Paul Sarag, I believe. And Leary told Bob to reach out to Saul Paul. And this was around 1975, I think. And then Bob sent a letter to Saul Paul, which is so crazy because it turns out like Saul Paul Sarag was living at Morgan. Is it Arthur Morgan? Arthur M. Young's house, which was it was an institute, institute to study consciousness, something like that, right? And they only live 4 blocks away from each other, in other words, and they're sending letters to each other, but they could walk to each other's place. And they linked up, Bob and Saul Paul, and then that started really, I'd say, Bob working with that group. Bob started attending meetings. He went to one meeting where he spoke about the Leary 8th Circuit model of intelligence, which had a different name then. It was called like the 24 Slots of Consciousness or something. And that was around 1976. Bob wrote about that lecture for the Berkeley Barb and wrote an article about it. So that's what's cool about when Bob links up with people. It's all documented, so it's very easy for the most part to research and find, and that was a fun
Something
part
else
of the
that's
research.
crazy about him is when he connects with people in another field, he connects with high level leaders in those fields and not only holds his own, but is like embraced by those people as an equal or a kindred spirit. It's real. I mean, it's really hard to overstate the profundity of that. Of like again, he wasn't just like a dilettante going from topic to topic. He had this ability to I guess it's the jet engine metaphor and what you said earlier, when he dives into something, he dives in deep and he can synthesize so much information and then apply it and then speak to it um, is an incredible mind. And then you think about, you add in all of the lifestyle, the moving, the family, the tragedy that his family's, the multiple tragedies they experienced that people can read about in the book, the dope, it's just the smoke haze through which he did it all. Um, it's really, really incredible. Couple other things. I know our time together is winding down. Someone wanted to know if you could comment at all about William Burroughs and Wilson. Again, I knew they had interactions. I didn't realize sort of the depth of it or how they were sort of recurring characters in each other's lives. I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, great question, Lawrence. Um, that was a bit of a research journey as well, because well, Bob in Cosmic Trigger, he writes in Cosmic Trigger that he first linked up with William S. Burroughs in 1966. Or I should say, I should take that back, that Burroughs first told Bob about the 23 Enigma in 1966. And I can test that in the book, um, because I have a letter that Bob wrote to Burroughs, which I accessed from the New York Public Library in the Burroughs archives that are the New York Public Library of yeah, it's one letter that Bob wrote to Burroughs in like June 1965, telling him that he was teaching a class at the Free University of New York about anarchism, and linguistics, stuff like that. And but he mentions like, oh, and here's Ed Sanders's phone number, right? Because Bob had known Ed Sanders and Tully Kupferberg, I believe, since around 1962. And Sanders and Kupferberg went on to form, the proto punk legendary group, the Fugs, right? But so Bob was in that scene, like when he was living in New Jersey and New York. I mean, he's from New York too. So like, I mean, when he was a kid, when he was a teenager and he was working in a bookstore, he met Ernest Hemingway. Ernest Hemingway bought a book, you know. So some people just, is it destiny? I don't know. He had that exactly right. Like when he was also prepared, right? So when he met these high level sort of people in all these fields, there's the 5% of phrase like a alike. There were a alikes. No be alikes. It was a alike. Like real recognize real. You know, um,
Yeah.
and when it came to that stuff, Bob had a really rigorous mind, man, in the underground, as outside of the academy, totally outside of the academy, nearly completely ignored. Like Jeffrey Mishloff told me, Jeffrey Mishloff, the parapsychologist and host and great, writer himself. He was tied in with the Berkeley scene. He knew all those physicists. He interviewed a lot of those physicists, knew a lot of scientists, and he knew Bob. But he told me like, yeah, like scientists didn't even really read Bob, which is crazy for me to think about because, of course, there's the quote from John Gribben, who is the particle or the quantum, who is the physicist who read Schrodinger's Cat trilogy and thought, what great physicist lurks in the mind of Robert Anton Wilson, and he's absolutely right. But it's just because Bob was not in those rooms. Because as he wrote about, and as we all know, people be politicking. That's it. you're in those little academic rooms. Here comes somebody without the degrees and without the, peer-reviewed journal articles. Like, get the fuck out of here. Like, we're not listening to you because you don't have the credentials. So Bob was outside, and he was breaking stuff down. And for the people who were listening, they knew, like, this guy really knows what's up.
Yeah.
About quantum entanglement.
Before we go, I want to leave what looks to be the last question for now, from my partner in crime, Michael. And his question is such a great one and it's so appropriate. He wants to know if you experienced any unexplained coincidences, serious related tomfoolery, or encounters with the puka while you were diving deep into the research and study of Bob.
Puka. I mean, I got,
Thanks, Michael.
well, the puka, as Bob writes, and it is in, I guess, the Irish lore, that one would be wandering alone home one night in the dark, and along would come the puka and just sweep you away into a vortex, a time portal, and bring you to the other world. And when you come back, not much time has passed, right? Kind of like Doc in Back to the Future, but
Or an alien abduction.
or yeah, definitely an alien abduction, puka abduction, and I mean, the journey of writing this book, like, getting personal a little bit, I never encountered such movement in my life. Like during the writing of this book, of course, COVID happened. And so both me and my girlfriend were out of work, right? And we decided to move states, and ended up in Los Angeles during the peak of COVID, right? Which was like a very different look of LA. And everything was a leap of faith. We were living basically in Airbnbs, like, it was very difficult to get an apartment at that time. And so I spent like 3 years constantly moving around. Like, for people who don't know, there is an economic apartheid happening in America, and it's the crux is in housing. There are 16 million unoccupied houses in America because banks have bought them and are holding on to them as an investment, while homelessness increases. And the people that were going to move into those houses get pushed to apartments, those families. So the real estate people look for those families for the apartments. They don't look for single people, et cetera, or like, people without families for these apartments. This is what's happening. This has been happening for years. And it only got worse during COVID. It didn't get better. Housing has not gotten better in this country.
Yeah.
So we're kind of caught up in the wave of that, man. Like, floating around, like, different Airbnbs for 3 years, Lawrence, was so intense. And it was like the whole writing of this book was one giant exercise and ritual and sympathetic magic, right? I wondered how Bob was able to move around so much when he was writing. And then it was like the universe was like, here you go.
You figured it
Like,
out. Yeah, you learned.
yeah, and like exponentially increase it. So instead of a few months, it was like every few days you had to keep moving, living on the run, man, like that, writing this book. And that was a very interesting period of time, because your mind, if you put yourself in a magical mind frame state, then synchronicities might be more likely to occur. So I had a number of synchronicities, one of which happened a little bit before the time I was just telling you. I basically decided to sign up for one of these websites where you could find public information about people, when I was researching Luna's murderer. So Bob and Arlen's 15-year-old daughter, Luna, was murdered in October 1976 when she was working only a few blocks down from their house. And Bob never writes much about this guy, which makes sense. And so I I did the research on this guy, and then I found out a fair amount about him. But long story short, you have to pay for these websites, right? So I
People
waited.
Finder or some shit.
Yeah, yeah, and I was like, all right, I gotta get paid first before I fucking do this, right? Got paid, got a paycheck, and I was like, all right, I'm gonna do this. And I looked this guy up and I find out all this information about this fella. Weeks later, when I'm looking back on it, I realized that the night that I was looking him up on People Finder and all this stuff, and he had passed away a number of years ago, it was his birthday. It was his birthday on the night that I just went all in doing this research. I had no plans to do this research. Like I kind of work like that sometimes. It's sort of like what do I feel like working on? And that was just really crazy timing. And then what I found out about this guy, when he went to prison, he got enrolled because you had to get special permission. They didn't just let anyone do this to join the fire conservation sort of squad. So prisoners that are used to put out large fires, forest fires, which that's actually a thing happening today. The controversy around that, like prisons abusing this notion of using prisoners to put out, or they're running out of people to fight fires, basically. So I thought it was really interesting that this individual signed up for that. What you're promised in return is a reduced prison sentence, which he got. Like he was released after like 5 years
Yeah, he didn't
in
serve much
prison.
time at all when you
No,
think that he took somebody's life in a senseless act.
yeah, I talked to a private investigator about that, and I was like, why was this guy released? And he said like in the 70s it was different in some ways, prison terms or whatever. But I have to say, like, writing about Robert Anton Wilson, the king of conspiracy theories, there's no way that you can't do like a processing his whole life through a conspiratorial lens, which I've done. I haven't written about it because it's a lot of speculation. But why was this guy released so soon? You can ask the question. But again, I asked an expert in the field, if you will, and he told me, well, at that time, prison sentences might have been definitely different. And again, he was in that fire conservation program, maybe led to early release. But so that I think that's a synchronicity really that stays with me.
It's a heavy
But
one.
there are other ones, man. Like when I started writing the book proposal for the book, that's when I started seeing UFOs like never before. It started like it was near Halloween, October, when I was working on this proposal many years ago, driving back from Target with my girlfriend, the semiotic alchemist. And we look out the window to the left side of the car was a hovering orange globe right above the tree line. And we pulled over immediately. And the moment I took out my phone to film it, disappeared, and blew me away. And I went on a little rabbit hole of investigating orange globes. And this didn't get in the book either, though. I think she'll be okay with this. When I interviewed Christina about their time living in Yellow Springs, she shared with me that when she was a kid, she saw an orange glowing orb in the forest of Yellow Springs, just like that. And so when you investigate these things, or you look up these UFO hunters, A&E TV shows, there's stories of that. There's reportings of this orange globe. This is a common UFO sort of reporting, right?
Yeah.
Observation. However, a couple years later, when I was in LA there, the semiotic alchemist and I were driving around Malibu, right? And coming upon the Santa Monica beach, we saw tons of orange globes floating in the sky. And I was like, what's going on? Are we really seeing this? And the closer we drove to the beach, we saw it was a bunch of people lighting those little balloon lanterns,
I
and they're
had
all
that
just
happen
floating.
too. Yeah.
So yeah.
Never
Um,
let reality get in the way of a good story, though.
yeah, man. I mean,
Listen, there is another question. There's a couple more that came through. Can I ask you another question, or do you need to jet?
oh no, not at all, man. This is great. I love this. Let's keep going.
Somebody asked about Eric Davis and if you corresponded or if you knew him and if you read High Weirdness. And for me, I'll just say that his work is some of my favorite. And so I guess we're all curious. What if any interaction have you had with Eric or his work?
Yeah, I think I've been in I contacted Eric a number of years ago. Pretty much I contacted most of these writers. I I've read some of Technosis. I love listening to Eric's talks. He has a great talk about like camera obscuria, which is all about perception and the imaginal realm, which is really, really great stuff. I've read some of High Weirdness. The thing is, that book came out while I was writing my book, right? And I just didn't want, I just, it's like when comedians are working on a set and sometimes you
Yep.
don't want to watch another set because you don't want to pick up anything, you know. And he's highly recognized and but I spoke with him a little bit during that time and yeah, he's like, oh, this is awesome. I'm glad you're writing a biography because I've focused more on Bob's ideas in High Weirdness. But I've watched lectures of him about High Weirdness. I mean, I think it's great. Yeah, 1973 was a really trippy year. Um, and of course, I've known about Eric Davis's work for a long time. I mean, I'm from New York. I knew he wrote for the Village Voice and stuff like that. Um, he was one of those writers, right, from the 90s because of Technosis, I think,
Yeah.
always been aware of.
When I had him on here, we had an interesting moment of realizing we were both at the same Grateful Dead shows at the same time in the Northeast. Back
Nice.
in the 80s. Um, well, I think we've reached the end. We've exhausted the audience questions. I could do another 3 or 4 hours with you, but I don't think that's fair to everybody on a Saturday. What I would say in parting, few things. Thank everybody who took time out of their Saturday to join us today. It means the world. You never know how people are gonna react when you put something out there. So it's so great to see so many people show up. Gabriel, thank you. I always love hearing from you and talking to you. And now whenever I feel like talking to you, I can pick up the book and hear your voice. But thank you so much for the book and for just getting to know you over the last year. Um, and I would just encourage everybody, pick up the book. We barely scratched the surface. It's a few hundred pages in small font. There's so much in there. And it also points the way to so many other potential books. There's so many things that you treat with sensitivity or that you just don't have time to go into that I think there's a lot of other, you could spend the rest of your life writing books based on things in this book. Um, but thank you so much, man.
Cool. Yeah, thank you, Lawrence. And yeah, I just want to quickly thank everyone that are in the acknowledgments of this book. I'm really, really grateful to show this work to the world, and the reception of it has been really awesome. I'm really, really grateful for that, and I'm glad that it's resonating with people. And my vision for it was I wanted to write a book that would be a resource for Bob heads from casual to academic, but I wanted to write a book that, reaches beyond that and is just the telling of a story of a person that lived on this earth, a real human being, because we're in a time when like it's just the idea of humanity is being diminished, and it's troubling to see, highly, highly troubling. And like when I wrote some of this book, and when we've already been through a bunch of stages, I was like, all right, we're out of Chapel Perilous. And like, as Michael Corleone says, like, I thought I was out, but they pull me back in, and here we are again, like one more round at Chapel Perilous. And I do believe that this book is a good resource for people during this time because they
Hell
could
yeah.
see how one person who who stood with his resolve throughout his whole life, and who didn't chase the shiny things for a quick payday. He made measured decisions like working for Playboy to feed his family, and I just think there's a lot about this character that people can learn from and apply today, And so I'm glad to bring it to the world, and thank you for hosting me, man. Like this was awesome. I
All
appreciate
right,
it.
my friend. Well, I hope for anybody that's joined us from America, you have a good holiday next week. And yeah, thank you, everybody. What a great time. Make sure you grab a copy of the book, get two, and give one as a Christmas present. All right. Take care, everybody.
TheToneArm.com.